welcome to the firm. On the show this week, unsecured creditors continue to challenge the traditional hierarchy and win. AAR plus MAT equals CONFUSION. So say tax experts. And how the PCAOB is working to improve communication between board audit committees and their audit firm. Lots of new developments on the show this week, so sit tight. Here we go. First up, an interesting Delhi High Court judgment. Statutory dues, secured creditors, then unsecured creditors, and finally, if anything's left, shareholders. That's the traditional credit hierarchy, and it gives unsecured creditors little or no say in a recovery process. Not anymore. Over the last 1 year, unsecured creditors, especially bondholders, have forced companies to sit up and listen. 3 cases come to mind immediately: Wockhardt, Zenith and the Thayal Group. This month, a trade creditor, also a type of unsecured creditor, challenged this credit hierarchy and won. Paiswani Upadhyay finds out if it will set a precedent for all unsecured creditors.
In October last year, Wockhardt FCCB holders filed a winding up petition and blocked an asset sale, obtaining a court order for repayment of dues worth 417 crore rupees. In February this year, Zenith Infotex bondholders filed a liquidation petition in the Bombay High Court after failing to recover dues worth 495 crore rupees. The court restrained the company from selling any of its assets. And just this month, a winding up plea in the Bombay High Court forced Thayal Group firm KSL to settle with its bondholders out of court. But it's not just bondholders breaking new ground. This month, for the first time, a trade creditor asserted its rights and won. Continental Carbon India, a supplier to the now SEG Modi Rubber, approached the Delhi High Court asking for the right to decline participation in the scheme to rehabilitate Modi Rubber.
If you go back in time, we had the judgment in relation to Wockhardt, which was also to deal with the rights of unsecured creditors. But there's a difference between the Wockhardt judgment and this Modi Continental judgment, for the simple reason that Wockhardt was in the context of winding up, and we're dealing with a company which was not declared as a SEG industrial company, i.e. not before the BIFR. The Delhi High Court judgment which we're talking about today is in the context of a SEG industrial company, and the powers of the board, the BIFR that is, to have a scheme of revival put in place. So while the Wockhardt judgment could have had persuasive value, now we have a definitive judgment even in the context of the BIFR.
The Delhi High Court granted Continental Carbon its wish. The order says an unsecured creditor has an option to decline the scaled-down value of its dues and wait to recover them till the rehabilitation scheme has worked itself out.
So it would certainly be a deviation from the practice so far, because historically schemes have involved, as you would imagine, a write-down of unsecured creditors, write down the amounts due to unsecured creditors, and and that's how they've operated. Now, for the first time, what the judgment provides is that a creditor can choose not to take the write-off of the amount due to him unless it specifically consents to, and should it choose to do so, it can seek the enforcement of the full amount that was originally due, provided the company does it at the end of the rehabilitation process.
Fundamentally, to exercise this right is not necessarily an attractive position to be in, because it comes with a negative as well. There is an inherent negative. So either you accept the scheme, which is what I think in practice has been happening most of the time, or you say, or your choice is really to say, I don't accept the scheme, but then you're really taking the risk of the company's performance in the scheme, because you have up to a 7-year wait period before you can enforce your claim, and a lot can happen in that 7 years. In those 7 years, the company might actually revive itself, which is what the unsecured creditor has to bet on, or the company might actually go under, and the scheme might be declared a failure, in which case the unsecured creditor's position has actually become much worse than it was.
Continental Carbon was willing to take that bet, and in the process led to a new interpretation of Section 18 of the SEG Industrial Companies Act, or SECA. SECA deals with the preparation and sanction of company revival schemes. Under SEG, a revival scheme requires mandatory consent from persons providing financial assistance, but it makes no mention of unsecured creditors. To date, that has been interpreted to mean unsecured creditors have no say. But the Delhi High Court took a different view, saying that just because the law is silent on unsecured creditors, it doesn't mean their rights can be ignored. Besides that, the High Court also pointed to Section 22 of SEG that deals with the suspension of legal proceedings and contracts to rule that provisions of SEG cannot override a contract between two parties if the creditor is willing to wait for the company to rehabilitate. That is, enforcement of remedy can be suspended but not done away with.
What the Delhi High Court, and we think rightly so, has recognized and laid down the law is, if the law is silent, it cannot be implied to mean that you can take away somebody's property. And they have also taken into account the fact that this very law does provide for a mechanism in which the secured creditors can be made to take a haircut. But what I think weighed in the mind of the court is that the Parliament could have very well provided something similar for unsecured creditors. And while not explicitly referred to in the judgment, there is also another provision of the same law which also allows the BIFR to even wipe out the shareholders or even reduce them, say, from 100% of holding in the company to even something like 2% or 10%, and allow the incoming person who's reviving the company to become the majority or the supermajority shareholder. So the law, where it wanted to explicitly deal with the rights or overrule the rights of a class of stakeholders, it has said so explicitly, and therefore the court was unwilling to infer that even if it doesn't say so in any manner for unsecured creditors, it can be read that we can still deal with unsecured creditors as the scheme may provide for.
I probably wouldn't entirely agree with the interpretation, because I think, like I mentioned before, it puts an extremely narrow scope in which the BIFR were to operate. If you say that, if you interpret it to mean that it cannot have a write down of debt in rehabilitating the company. Also, if I were to extend that logic of the Delhi High Court, effectively, in order to impose such a write down, it is requiring the consent of an unsecured creditor, which is not what the statute really contemplates. And where it does contemplate such a consent, it has specific, from certain classes of creditors, it has specifically provided for that consent, for example in section 19, which are the banks and public financial institutions, etc. So the contra way to look at it is that it imposes the requirement of a consent when none is specifically contemplated in the SEG.
At the appellate authority level, Modi Rubber, the SEG company in question, argued that granting a creditor the right to stay out of the scheme can put the company's revival in jeopardy. The appellate authority agreed, the Delhi High Court did not.
Going forward, if we were to operate in the regime that the Delhi High Court has set out, it certainly puts a far greater onus on the board or the operating agency to ensure that it tries and gets the consent of as many stakeholders as possible, which is not something that it was doing to that length prior to this order. And the other risk is that you can have a situation where a company is not really the rehabilitation of the company itself is made that much more difficult, because today it is one creditor in this case, but tomorrow it could be a class of say 5 or 10 creditors, or a much more significant proportion of creditors who choose to stay out of the scheme, potentially therefore jeopardizing the success of the scheme itself.
I think it's an important order, not just in terms of recognizing rights of unsecured creditors, but recognizing rights of parties in the context of statutes overall. Fundamentally, what the order says is that an unsecured creditor, if they are going to be required to make any sacrifices, or if they are going to be required to provide any financial assistance to a borrower, then in order for them to be bound by the terms of the scheme that require them to make such sacrifices or provide financial assistance, there must be a process that is followed for taking their consent. And that fundamentally an unsecured creditor in this case, but I think more importantly as a principle, any person cannot under statute be forced to give up anything or part with property unless the statute has an express mechanism for allowing that to happen.
Commercially, not many unsecured creditors may jump onto the let's wait it out bandwagon. After all, who knows whether the SEG company will ever revive? But that may not be the best way to measure the impact of this judgment, that whether more unsecured creditors will follow suit. Their inferiority in the credit hierarchy just got a leg up, and that's the principal alteration made for the first time. In Mumbai, Faisal Upadhyay.
Well, good news for unsecured creditors. On that note, let's take a quick break on the film, but don't go anywhere. Coming up on the other side, how the PCAOB is working to improve communication between board audit committees and their audit firm.